We have decided. Declaration number 3. We declare that the season of multiplication is at our door. Therefore, we have decided to open wide the door and welcome the harvest. We all know that 4 plus 4 equals 8, or at least it did when I was in school. We also know that 4 times 4 equals 16. The same numbers are in both equations, yet the results completely differ. That's the difference multiplication makes in math and in life. We have found that God is more often multiplying His benefits and blessings rather than adding to them. He's even built multiplication into nature. The farmer never plants seed in the ground expecting that each seed will add one other seed. No, he plants with multiplication in mind, knowing that from the seed he plants, the harvest will be enough to feed himself, provide for others, and supply enough to produce another crop. Paul encourages us in this area of multiplication when he writes, "Now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food, supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness." If multiplication is knocking on our door, we should explore what that looks like and how we are to respond. Let's look at the stories of 2 widows facing life-threatening circumstances. The first story is of the widow whose wheat and oil had run out, with no way of getting more. All she had was enough to feed her son one last meal. When the prophet Elijah came and asked for her only meal, he also came with a promise. "The bin of flour shall not be used up, nor shall the jar of oil run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the earth." The prophet's words came true. And instead of God replacing the last meal with another, He multiplied the provision and provided miraculously until the natural health and process of the land returned to provide for her. Multiplication. The second story also involves a destitute widow and a prophet of God. In this narrative, it is the prophet Elisha that interacts with the widow. The widow had young boys to care for, little for which to provide, and an overwhelming debt she owed because of her husband's sudden death. When the prophet arrived, he came with a promise hidden in an instruction. The prophet instructed her to take what little oil she had left and begin to pour it into as many vessels as she could collect. When she followed his instruction, the oil filled all the vessels and didn't run out until there were no more vessels to fill. When the widow sold the oil, there was enough to pay off the debt and an abundance left over for her and her sons to live on. Multiplication. In each of these stories, there is a key to accessing multiplication: immediate and complete obedience. When multiplication came knocking on their door, the widows activated the provision by following the instructions of the prophets. The one widow offered her last meal, and the other gathered the vessels and began to pour out of a near empty jar. The widows partnered with the promises, and multiplication was the result. Faith is the other key that, partnered with obedience, is essential to the process of multiplication. Quote, "But without faith it is impossible to please Him, for he who comes to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him." Unquote. Here is my personal amplified version of this scripture from a word study of the key phrases. Quote, "But without faith, any approach to God void of faith, it is impossible, having no possibility of a desired result, to please God, to give God His greatest pleasure. For he who comes to God, approaches in order to seek favor, must believe a once and for all unconditional trust that He is, that God exists, is personal and real, and that He is, shows Himself to be, a rewarder, a paymaster, one in debt to no one, of those who diligently seek Him, investigate, demand, or require to seek a favor of with the expectation of receiving. Unquote. Let's simplify this. Quote, faith is acting on the belief that God is present to us and is by his very nature one who rewards those who place a demand on him with an expectation that he will do what he says he will do. In so doing, our act of faith gives him the pleasure he deserves, for his greatest pleasure is to be believed. Unquote. The term demand may paint a picture of an arrogant exchange with God, mandating that he do something for us. In the context of the verse, this is not the case. Let me illustrate this meaning this way. If I go to the bank in which I have an account, write a check and hand it to the clerk, I am putting a demand on my account in that bank. It is not arrogance or self-importance, but simply faith that the bank has been holding funds that belong to me and has agreed to release those funds upon my request. When we come to God in faith, we are writing a check on the provision for the promises he has placed in our account. This places a demand on what God has promised, and he takes pleasure in fulfilling it. There's no arrogance involved, but confident belief that God is who he says he is and will do what he says he will do. All increase comes from God. Every good gift comes from the hand of the Father. Doubt is the absence of faith and keeps us from moving in the quick and complete obedience to his word. It is the thief that steals our increase and closes the door to the multiplication God intends for us. Faith unlocks provision and the more of God. Let's look again at Paul's instruction to the Corinthian church. Quote, now may he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food supply and multiply the seed you have sown and increase the fruits of your righteousness. Unquote. Notice that God supplies the seed and is the multiplier of the seed. Again, all increase comes from him. But also pay attention to the statement that he multiplies the seed that we sow, not the ones we hold. Faith that brings increase requires an action, the sowing of the seed. Unplanted seed produces nothing, for it requires no faith. But planted seed put at risk, produces because it is planted in faith. We have decided that the time of multiplication is knocking at our door. We believe it is knocking at the door of our families and at the door of our church. So through faith acted on in swift obedience, we throw open the door and welcome the increase God has promised.